In today's episode, we're going to talk about working globally in uncertain times.
Your someday starts today. It's time to explore and test the newest science, methods, and trends for creating a life you love with your host, Tanyamfk. Welcome to My Designed Life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to My Designed Life, where we learn and test the latest science, tips, tools, and strategies for you to create your best life every day. You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at My Designed Life Show and at Tanyamfk. And if watching videos isn't your thing, head over to My Designed Life Show podcast and catch the audio. I'm Tanyamfk, and I am so glad that you are here. Now, for today's show, we are going to have a very interesting twist on what we're going to focus on. So having trained thousands of executives with work highlighted on CNN, Entrepreneur, and Fortune magazine, my guest today shows businesses how to lead and connect on a global level, strengthening teams and increasing businesses across regions. Seeing that up to 70% of global ventures failed due to something as common as cultural differences, he teaches us how to beat those odds with specific skills of cross-cultural understanding and adapting to our new fast-paced and connected planet. He has spent the last 15 years being a global road warrior and is joining us from Singapore to talk about global opportunities for entrepreneurs and nomads in our new normal and this work from home and remote work kind of life. Please welcome founder of Leadership Nomad, Kyle Hegarty. Welcome, Kyle.
Welcome to My Designed Life.
Thank you, Tanya. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you as well. So I'm really excited to have you here. It's an interesting climate right now, and you have a new book called The Accidental Business Nomad, a survival guide for working across a shrinking planet. And I think everyone is in need of a survival guide at this moment. So what is in this? What is in this survival guide here? What is in this book?
Send help, right?
Yes,
so,
yes,
I
SOS.
I think the timing's pretty good for this. For unfortunate reasons, this certainly wasn't the plan. What I focus on and what I've been doing for the last decade and a half is working remotely all over the place with companies and teams that are more and more distributed. And now all of a sudden that's just gone up exponentially.
Yeah.
And often what happens in those situations is that things become more stressful. Video conferencing tends to fry people a little bit, stress them out, time zones. There are a bunch of ideas and tools and tips that people can start applying to their daily behavior to make their lives just easier.
Yeah.
And some of it's counterintuitive, some of it's very obvious. But a couple of these tools just right off the bat, I think that people need to be thinking about is the fact that conference calls and working remotely, because you lose all of the face-to-face time, you lose the body language, you lose the kind of those intangible pieces of just being in front of people. We've got to rethink how we build and maintain relationships, whether it's with our colleagues or with customers. And so the thing that I focus on would be a specific areas that look at behavioral psychology, to work on relationship building, to deal with conflict, to deal with the fact that, all of a sudden, whether it has to do with COVID-19 or just other trends, I think more and more of us are working across borders.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's all this culture piece that you had mentioned, which I focus on a lot as well. So there's different data sets that I look at to get into that. And I've just thrown a bunch of ideas at you, and we can unbundle any or all of them if we want.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of us are familiar with things getting lost in translation, if you will, with text, right? So like if we text, it's like, oh, we can take a text wrong. But I don't think we're as aware of how it can happen now in this new culture of like our meetings, our virtual meetings, how things that we're missing out, like you said, on that camaraderie. It's not a direct replacement. And so there are some issues that can come up.
It's not an accident that emojis have become a thing in the last, 5 or 10 years. And the reason is it's correlated directly with texting and the fact that we're doing more and more email and communication using these smartphones, which aren't very smart all the time, or at least the people using them aren't very smart. The problem with texting and with emailing is that it eliminates tone and it eliminates body language. And emojis are essentially replacements for that, or attempted replacements for that. I have fought them for many years. I wasn't naturally a fan of them.
Yeah.
I think that actually they're really useful and helpful.
I went the same route. I thought they were so ridiculous like years ago, and now you see how useful they are. So how do you think we come into that issue with, even you mentioned even with our calls, that we're not having the same interaction, we're not having the same interaction with people who are now working from home. How can things be misinterpreted, do you think, even in like video calls?
So it's funny because they, funny in a not so funny way, but they started talking about this phrase social distancing a couple of months ago, right? We all have to start practicing social distancing. And I'm looking at a couple of my colleagues that have been doing remote work research for years, and we're going, they're using this phrase. This is a phrase we've been using for a decade and a half, because social distancing is the #1 problem of remote teams. And it's this factor of it, and I'll give you just examples. So you've got two offices, satellite offices, and they're doing a remote call. Well, it turns out when the researchers were looking at the details, oftentimes the biggest takeaways from meetings happen right before the meeting starts or right after it starts, in informal chit chat, side conversations, these little conversations in the elevator ride up before you go into a meeting room. All of a sudden, then you're in front of somebody, maybe, in another office on the other side of the world. And the second that call ends, you're now with that one other person, and maybe there's a glance, maybe there's that look, and it's going, well, there's no way that's going to happen, right? Like any kind of variation of that. But isn't, that little jokey example, that's it.
Wow.
Well, I mean, there's all this sort of politics, and the problem is that most people aren't dumb. And so they kind of know this side chatter is going on. Even if people are all completely isolated, there's going to be texting, there's going to be these little mini tribes. Silos build, and they build really fast. They build up really fast. So the politics starts corroding away at team cohesiveness because of this side chatter, which is referred to, we've been calling it social distance problems for years. And so now all of a sudden that's just gone, now everybody's facing it. So I think this, in some ways, this is a behavioral psychologist's dream to be able to study the masses as they go through these learning curves.
Yeah, because like you said, we have people like you and I who have been working remotely and in remote situations and globally for many years. But there are tons of businesses that have just been thrown into this with no experience, no ideas of how to deal with it. I actually had a girls' night out, if you will, virtual on Zoom, and a friend of mine, I was sending links. To me, it's all normal. I just do this. I do the Zoom call. I send it out. I get the calendar invite. And about a week later is when her business closed, and her business, if you will, she was a teacher. And so she told me, she's like, I'm so glad that you had that Zoom call, because I had no idea how to use it. And now it's what I have to do all the time. I would have been so lost. And in my head, I was like, well, like you're in your bubble. So you think everyone knows how to use this, but there's so many people who've been thrown into this just recently in this atmosphere.
I was doing, I had a coaching program going on with two individual executives, pretty senior level people, about presentation, elocution, and executive presence improvements. And this whole thing hit, we got into lockdown. Thankfully, I like to point out a lot of the stupid mistakes that I've made in the book. It's filled with it. But in this case, I did something right. I had a line item in my contract that said, if we can't meet face-to-face under extenuating circumstances, we can do this remotely via Zoom or Skype, right? This was written back in 2019, which seems like 20 years ago.
Right. It might as well be 20 years ago.
I said, okay, bingo, let's just, here we go, extenuating circumstances. And both of them didn't have computers with cameras, and they didn't know how to turn on their computer microphone.
Wow.
And, it's not like these are, and again,
intelligent, high-level people. Yes,
these are people who are tech savvy people in a very well-known business, very well-known industry. And I was, that one surprised me.
Right,
So
right.
a lot of us were caught unaware of how to adapt. With that said, I think that a lot of companies have done a pretty, it's Friday night, so I'll be a little bit more colorful. They've done a pretty good damn good job considering all the moving pieces and the craziness that's happened. So I think people have been. I think generally the story is one of people picking up and making stuff happen regardless of the situation.
Well, and that I think is part of the human spirit in general, what we can do. So back to your book, it is a survival guide for working across, this shrinking planet. So I guess there are some more issues that you've seen, and obviously some tools. So what are some of those other things that we've come across?
So we've just been talking about remote teams, and I think a lot of people think of that from almost like a homogenous country level or a cultural level. So maybe your audience might be thinking about it from one particular country. They may have remote teams across a state or a particular country. What's happened in the last certainly 20 years, 10 years, 20 years, has been this explosion of companies going global. That could be back office work, that could be outsourcing. Customers are now all over the place. Team members are scattered. There's tons of statistics and data that suggests that we've now just all of a sudden sort of ended up in this global environment. My argument
and that's not limited. I would just say that's not limited to these giant businesses either. I mean, for myself, with a very small, tiny business, I have a team member in Argentina. I have one in California, and my clients are all over. China, we're here. So I mean, we're working across time zones at all times.
The one of the statistics I saw was that in the U.S., 50% of SMB companies have clients that are international. And they engage in overseas conversations once a week or something like that. That's 50% of SMBs. So then you look at the data from large companies, MNCs, multinational. So it was like 70% of people in MNCs are talking to people in 2 or 3 different continents every single day.
Right.
So this
I was going to say, I just had a call on Tuesday, and it didn't hit me till later. It was, I remember starting at 6 a.m. I had a call in Argentina, and 8 it was Thailand. The next it was the Netherlands. Then I was in China. Then I was in New York. And I was like, wow, I have had an international day today.
The book was called The Accidental Business Nomad, because I think both you and I, in many ways, this happened by accident. I didn't orchestrate this. I followed the business. I followed the opportunities, right? And as a small business person, as an entrepreneur, that's what you do. Companies today are born global. And that's a very different starting point than where we were in other eras. And that, to me, is where everything kind of gets started for me. That's where my story starts, because I think that companies have gone global, but people haven't. And so it's that invisible stuff that starts getting in the way, and it happens kind of quickly, or the first couple weird things happen and you don't quite know what it was, but all of a sudden these things start snowballing on themselves. And I'll
do you
give
have any examples? Yeah, please.
A ton. So people communicate differently in different parts of the world. In a business setting, if I'm from the US originally, I'm a direct communicator. I am very task focused in terms of how I do business. So for me, it's let's get on a call. Let's jump into the agenda. Let's see what makes sense. Do you agree with that? Yes or no? Will we do this as a next step? Yes or no? And oftentimes, that's not how things are done in other parts of the world. So I've just now set myself up with, hypothetically, this other person, and they might be thinking, this guy is here's another crazy American who, is just kind of plowing into this conversation. There's a trust problem. There's a trust problem that's going to start all sorts of issues. what do people do in situations where they're asked direct questions? They generally say yes, because that'll maybe shut this loud guy up, and we'll figure this out later. But oftentimes indirect communicating, and I'll get into more details on this because there's data around this, but indirect communicating cultures don't really say no,
right?
Because that might be considered rude.
Yes.
So one of the most common things that happen, and I'll tell you a quick side story in a second, is people who come from direct communicating cultures will ask a question. So maybe I'm working with and this happened to me 20 years ago. I was working with a team out of Chennai, India. Hey guys, here's the plan. Here's the code. Any questions? Does this make sense? And you get the yes. Can you get this done by Friday? That's possible. Yes. Okay, done. So I go to my client. Okay, it's happening on Friday. We're all good to go, right? That's my interpretation of what just happened. Friday comes, this thing hasn't even started because nobody understood what the heck I was talking about. And I got into so I've been working abroad for 15 years, but my first international project was 20 years ago, 2000 and 2001, managing a team out of India from Boston. And so this is exactly what was happening to me every single day. And I'm not trying to single out India, but there's a lot of these miscommunications.
Right. The cultural differences.
Fast forward 20 years later, before the lockdown, I spent a lot of time in India. And I spent a lot of time in the airport lounges in India. And I spend a lot of time listening in on other people's conversations in the airport lounges in India. And it's oftentimes Western executives who are sitting there drinking too much because they're so frustrated because they've had to fly to India to fix a campaign that's gone off the rails. And this is history repeating itself. It happens to companies over and over and over again. And again, I'll pick on India just for the sake of this example, but this is a problem across the board. India has a lot of this happening because so much back office work, programming work went there, right? And a lot of it ended up getting pulled back because a lot of companies said, these guys don't know what they're doing. They don't understand what I'm trying to say. India didn't work for us. Right. And a couple $1 million+ later, they're still trying to figure stuff out. You can look at other companies; they're doing just fine in India.
Right.
Same talent.
So
same
what's
talent
the difference?
Pool.
Right.
What's the difference? It's a cultural communication barrier, and so that to me was this is why my business I pivoted towards focusing on this, because the money that is being lost to these types of issues has been just going like absolute crazy. And now that we're heading into what most likely will be a pretty significant global downturn, people can't afford to screw this stuff up anymore. Yeah, we could kind of get away with it, when the tide was rising all boats. But this is a different game now. Yeah, we got to tighten up our process.
We need to be concise. Well, and I want to highlight that. It went by really quick, but just highlight that right there. And when you started talking about the lounges and the people going, I had to come all the way out here to fix it. Yes. And of course, then the outlook and assumption is, like you said, well, they obviously don't know what they're doing, or this just doesn't work for us. It clearly works for others, but not for us. And what you found out and what you've done and what some of the data suggests is that it's not that at all. It's about, that's the way we communicate based on the cultural differences, nuances and understanding. And that was the same thing you mentioned in your example from China with the, yes, we got it, because that is actually a cultural thing. You can actually read about that. If you actually, I lived in China for a year. So if you go into that, it's considered rude to say no. Right. And so, in that case, it's actually, you need to kind of sort it out off to the side and everything will stay clear. They'll say, wait, I don't know what you're saying. But on the spot, it doesn't work. And if you don't know that, like you said, you go into that as an American going, okay, I asked directly, you answered me directly. We're all on the same page. Good to go. Where's the miscommunication? And
we'll take it another step further, which is the people that often and again, we'll use the US as, because I think a big part of the global growth story in the last 20 years has been Western companies expanding into
Yes.
Emerging markets, which
That's
are
absolutely fair to
largely
say.
across Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So who are the people in those, we'll use US as an example. Who are the people in those, or the types of people in those companies who raise their hand? It is the ambitious, aggressive, task-focused. You could call them alpha. It depends on your behavioral profiling system that you like, a dominant personality type or behavior type. And
they're go-getters.
They're go-getters. They're very direct. They kind of speak up. They drive things to get across the line. Well, you put that personality type, that behavior type into a market, into an environment where the opposite traits are present or kind of more prevalent, it's a recipe for a comedy / tragedy.
I was going to say, like a bad comedy.
It depends on who's paying the bill. But as an outsider, there's certainly some funny stories. But my God, it can get really frustrating quickly. And this is what I went through, because I check all of those boxes from the Western standard, like just the way I am. I see an opportunity and I go for it, and I get incredibly competitive and task focused to get this thing across the line. And that turns out is a style that does not go over very well in a majority of the planet, which is really interesting. The people like me, the people like who create training programs, grad school programs, sales training, leadership training, management processes. These are people who more often than not who come from Western parts of the world. They have direct communication styles, and they have a background where hierarchy is not as ingrained as other parts of the world. And we are a minority in a massive way. So you've got this small percentage of people who are pushing out all of this content and these ideas to a world that doesn't see the things in the same way at all.
Right. So I was going to say, is there like a kind of set of things? I mean, we've talked about some specific examples, but I mean, is there a certain type of cultural information that's general that we need to understand different working styles?
Yeah, good question. And look, it's Friday night here, so I'm on the line here.
It's a cultural thing.
And you've got me all fired up now. Now I'm getting all stuff going. Yeah.
Let's do it. I love it. I can keep with my team.
This is part of the working across time zones.
Yes, absolutely.
I'll answer your question in a minute, but a side story is one thing that when the social life starts opening up again in a place like Singapore, I'm sure you saw it in China, but almost every single night you'll see people standing outside of bars and pubs anywhere from 9 to 12, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Many of them are on global conference calls because that's how the time zone works, right? The Asia Pacific people, we get hit with the late night stuff.
Right.
And I cannot tell you the number of inebriated colleagues that people are probably speaking to across Southeast Asia who are wobbling around outside trying to pretend like they're in a work environment.
They're like, yes, understand, absolutely. Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, so I was doing work when I was in China. I remember it was like I had 7 a.m. was the only time, and it was like 9 p.m. for everyone else, I think. So it was always interesting what I was going to get on the other side.
That's right. You never know what you're up against. But so anyway, but to get to your point, which is a huge one, because this is something that I was trying to figure this stuff out, because what we're talking about, I use the word hierarchy, I use the word indirect communication. To me, these are invisible concepts. These are things that, language difference is one thing. You can hear that.
Right.
You can hear if you're speaking Chinese, if I'm speaking English, I get the difference.
You're like, oh yeah, it's not the same. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I'm talking about the invisible stuff. And what my kind of aha moment was when I stumbled into, there's decades of research that's been done on this. I'm not the first person to go through this, right? This is not new.
Right.
This is something that really since after World War II, really in the 70s, it picked up in a bigger way. People have been doing very organized behavioral research that looks at cultural differences in a work environment specifically. And so you get guys like Hofstede, who actually just died recently. He was in his late 90s. Geert Hofstede out of the Netherlands. His son's still doing it, doing the research now. He came out with a project starting in the 70s, and the data continues now. There's other large data sets. And essentially what they're doing is they're doing mega surveys to people in different parts of the world, asking the same questions. How do you like to be managed? How do you receive feedback? How do you feel about confrontation? How do you solve problems? How do you think about, new ideas? How do you communicate those ideas? How do you learn? Tons, and then just tons of other questions that way. And you ask 100,000, a million, couple million people, and you start tracking what's their background culture, and patterns start emerging. And so what you end up with are these really interesting data sets that have attempted to break apart these differences, define them, and show the gaps, or the how people score, right? So you end up with a data set. There's people today who have taken this data, and I think that they've taken it to some degree of a next level. Erin Meyer, if you've heard of her, she wrote a book called Culture Map. Okay. She's out of INSEAD. If you're interested in the topic, it's a good book for people to read. Andy Malinsky out of Brandeis, Global Dexterity. These are people who have both, I think, taken some of these concepts and done some good data visualization to make it so that you can actually see. So let's get into, I'll give you some examples. So what they were showing was, look, United States, Netherlands, Germany, Australia are direct communicating cultures. China, not so much. India, not so much. Indirect. There, a lot of the Japan is probably the most indirect speaking culture in the planet. Thailand, Indonesia are also incredibly indirect places. Now, you can go country by country and take a look at this stuff. This is macro data. Obviously, this doesn't represent every individual at all. So you have to take it as a macro data set. You can't take it literally. But I found it a very helpful starting point to at least better get my head around what was going on.
Well, I think it helps you set your expectations, if nothing else. Like you said, it literally affects how you're going to work, how you're going to communicate, and knowing these little nuances will change, how you're asking about deadlines, or asking, actual expectations, and what to expect from that. And one of the things that hit me while you were explaining, like the history of research that's been done on working in these different environments and people working together, is that while there's still a lot of this information, it's been studied for a long time, I feel, and I'm just surmising here, but I feel like back in the days, you would fly and have back in the days, like last year, but no, like back in the days, before remote work was a real thing, before Zoom was a thing, before, or, I shouldn't say Zoom, but all the companies that do these video conferencing, before that was a thing, you had to get in a plane or some sort of transportation and physically go to the place. So you experienced, from the moment you stepped off that plane, train, or automobile, that you were very aware you were somewhere different, so you may not have been aware of the business nuances or cultural nuances, but you were very clear you weren't home. And so I think now in this remote type of work, we're in our bubble. So we're even so much further removed from any reminders that, oh, wait, they're in Argentina, they're in, Thailand right now. Our backgrounds start to look the same. The technology is the same. So I think it's that much more important to really talk about this now, as it may seem normal that we're so connected, but it's actually even more so that we need to remember we are culturally different. There are different things.
Yeah, I think our connectivity, the fact that we are a button click away, is new. It's never happened before, but in many ways it has grown the cultural barriers. The cultural barriers have actually grown as the distance barriers have collapsed.
Right, right.
Or just your example, your day where you're talking to people from, I don't know, you listed half a dozen plus countries. And in my head, you know, the data sets are kind of like trickling through going, oh my, yeah, you're zigging and zagging across some very different ways of doing business.
Yes. Yes.
And
even the way my tone of voice is sometimes. And like, I'm very mindful of like, okay, my next client, we're here, we're subdued, we're a little calmer, we're this. Other ones we like get excited and we go woohoo and say stuff like that.
Well, so the things that I train people with would be just, and we'll go, I keep picking on India, but so we'll stick with our India story just for the time being. But, you know, these guys, these people will say, well, how do I get an agreement on a deadline? You know, and to me, the problem is that oftentimes it's the language that we use. I might, and you might be comfortable with a close-ended question. Is this going to get done by Friday? That's a yes or no answer. Right. But why would you ask a close-ended question to somebody who's only going to give you one answer? Because culturally they've been programmed to do that. I would argue that you've just cornered yourself, right? Whose fault is that? It's the fault of the person asking. I mean, so you've got to rewire your script.
What would we say in that case? Let's get like what would be a better way than knowing that?
And you have to be careful with the advice here. So you have to be careful because the advice is often to use softening statements to soften it. The danger with that is that you can end up being too vague and actually not getting a agreement to anything, right? So one thing to do is, again, here's our hypothetical that people haven't, we've got a due date next Friday. So instead of saying, is this thing going to get done on time? You know, do you have any questions? Is there any reason, you could change it and say, well, I wonder if you could walk me through the steps that you and your team will take so that we can get to the deadline by next Friday. Would you be able to just walk me through what those next steps look like? Right. And essentially what I'm asking people to do is to spend more time on these calls, or maybe it's setting up more calls for a little bit more, I don't want to use micromanaging, but certainly being more careful about what's going on. And oftentimes that small amount of time addition at the beginning pays massive dividends to get this stuff finished on time.
Yeah, because missed deadlines can cost a lot.
Can cost huge amounts, absolutely huge amounts. So it's something, and that doesn't sound that complicated, but I don't know about you. I mean, I still have to really prep for that beforehand. For years, I in my old office, I had a printout and it just said, I wonder if ... And I deliberately would stare at that because I had to get those close-ended questions out of my head for most of the conversations that I was having. I wonder if we could take a little bit of a deeper dive into this. And then even before the conversation ends, what I call ultimate active listening. So active listening, you've probably heard, is paraphrasing or rephrasing what you've just heard. Critical to anything, especially from a cross-cultural standpoint. It's like, if there's one thing people walk out of here with as a tool to start using more, if you are on virtual teams, I don't care what part of the world your colleagues are from,
right?
Use active listening as often as possible without being annoying. So, because the goal is to clarify, right?
Yeah. This is the tool for everyone, is what he's saying.
This is like, everybody needs this. Right?
Yeah.
Husbands, wives, everybody needs this. But so it's to do that. But what I call ultimate active listening, which is have somebody play the whole thing back before you wrap up a conversation. Because oftentimes, you and I might think we're in agreement, and then we shut off our little Zoom session, and you go down one path and I go down another path, and only do we figure out how far off we are when we next connect.
Right. How do we do that? I love this because I'm a paraphraser. I love to recap everything.
Yeah.
But to have the other person do it as a mom, the only thing in my head I can think is like, what did I just say? And I don't think that would come across very easily.
You've got to be, I think tone and delivery is absolutely critical, right? So because you don't want to come across being patronizing. You don't want to be, so there's a couple of ways to do it, but essentially I think, I don't know, this is the way I think about it. It's like a movie. I want you to play back. Can you before we wrap up, walk me through your next steps. I just want to make sure we're both on the same page.
Okay.
I will tone that down or soften it with like a mini example. Hey, the reason I'm doing this, I'm not trying to be a pain in the butt, but I was doing a project similar to this, and this person accidentally went this way, and I didn't check on it. It was my fault, and I'm paranoid. So this is why.
Right. So you have a kind of a qualifier, or like you said before, I like the. Replay through your next steps, because it personalizes it to them, as opposed to, did you hear what I said? I want to make sure you heard what I said. So instead, it's like, so just for and you can always bring it to yourself, just for myself. What were those points again? And it's okay, well, I'm going to work on this. I'll work on that. And as a coach, and consultant, that's a lot of what I do, is we work through what are your next steps. This is what we'll do. We create a strategy. And then I'm very mindful at always recapping that. Okay, so what we discussed is we'll do this, this, and this. But what I'm hearing here is I'm missing that component of having them tell me what they heard. And so being able to say, like, okay, so what are your next steps? Like you said, isn't patronizing, isn't like very motherly. Now, did you hear what I said? It just allows them to walk through it, and also you to confirm that, we are on the same page.
Correct. Yeah. Right. And again, you got to be so careful with tone. If you are new to managing a team, or you've got a new team member, again, this is my direct background, have that upfront conversation. Here's how I'm doing this. I'm going to be asking you, sometimes I'm going to be asking you to feed back some stuff to me before I wrap up a call. I'm not doing this because I don't trust you, or because I don't think you can't do it. And then I'll give an example of a time where I've made a mistake in the past, right? So
Oh, I love that. You set it up in the beginning.
Just so they know, this guy
is how I function. This is how I work.
How he is.
Yes. I love that.
And that's a good way to establish how this works. And there are a lot of companies, and I think it'll probably accelerate, have been pivoting more to like the concept of agile teams. So basically, we're going to put this team together for 3 months to do this one project, and we found this guy with a skill set in Bangalore, and this guy is in Germany, and this guy's in the States. Okay, great in theory, but this is assuming that they all have the same communication style and working style. So this is like the critical conversation that these types of agile teams should be having before they even get started.
Yeah. And that's not usually a focus at all. That completely glossed over. Other than a basic introduction, hey, this is Frank, Tom, and Joe. There's not really much else happening, as opposed to like, okay, so are we even made aware sometimes, maybe as our own, being aware of our own working style, or the way that we.
That's right. So a big part of this, and I get into this in the book. It's like this is all about. I think the chapters. It's like, think about you. You've got to think about yourself first, right? And you can't adapt to other people unless you know where you stand.
Right.
So I'm a huge fan of getting people to go through these, behavioral assessments. I just had a whole group this week do a giant thing about their communication styles. Where do they stand on the spectrum? Honestly, there's nothing right or wrong, but just understand that a majority of the people that you're working for see the world and behave in very different ways.
Yeah.
So get that stuff out up front. You've got to come up with a meeting in the middle, or some type of almost like a third culture, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, you want a team to be able to establish, this is what we're going to agree to. So I have teams build what I call communication contracts. So let's build an agreement as to let's define the invisible stuff. Let's define what we're trying to do. We're going to screw it up. Let's acknowledge this. Let's not take ourselves too seriously here. but let's be able to acknowledge that moment when we've just had that and be able to get over it faster.
How do you get them to acknowledge their different communication styles? Is that like in the kind of the chapter, the way you set it up, or?
Yeah, it's my experience doing the behavioral tests and the communication stuff. I've done these programs around the planet. I should probably find out how many. I don't know if I've done it in probably 20 or 25 countries and I don't know, 80 or so other people, people from 80 different countries or so.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody seems to be into it because people like to people want to be told more about themselves.
Yeah, people like to know about themselves. That's why personality tests are so, that's why what kind of potato your friend is, because people love quizzes and information about themselves.
And so I find that when you come in there and you give people this little test, maybe, it can be a little bit goofy. There's a whole spectrum of like scientifically valid stuff, which I'm more of a fan of generally,
right,
to the, what type of Game of Thrones character
right,
are you? Which,
like I was saying, what kind of potato are you? It goes everywhere.
Right. Let's hopefully stick a little bit more on the science-driven side, but across the board, people like to do that, and they like to use that report as a easier way to have a difficult conversation with people. In other words, it says here that you avoid confrontation in situations. I'm not saying you do. I'm just saying that's what the report says.
Right.
It's an easier way to start a difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I get people to try and build out their own, actually there's another, I stole this idea, or I referenced this guy out of the UK, Sabatoth. He wrote a good book. I'll reference that and send it to you as well.
Yes. No, Chaba's great. I'm very pleased.
That's right.
Uncommon sense. Uncommon sense.
That's right. He connected the two of us.
Yeah, for something. I forget what but I read his book. His book is actually amazing. And it's all on those same lines. Absolutely. Of that, what we think it's all this way, but actually using the uncommon sense is where we'll find the connection of how to work with people. So yeah.
One of the things he does, and I think it's a great idea, is he has people build out what I think he calls it a passport. And it's more about a communications passport. We all have different passports. So like here, and in an ideal world, if all of a sudden you and I are working on a team, how much easier would it be if we just exchanged passports for a day? Just let me read what it is that you're thinking about. What pisses you off? What annoys you? What motivates you? Right? That's a powerful starting point to really build team cohesion fast.
So these are really the tools, that you kind of have outlined in your book of how to improve the communication in these remote work type of situations, global work situations, just like different pieces like this, right?
That's exactly right. So I like to, I think that the data it's a great starting point. It's not perfect. No data, none of these models are, but I find that you can use that as a foundation to start building tools on top of to help people, especially in times of uncertainty and stress, because under duress, under stress, we tend to become more of our core behavior types. If you think about it from a behavior model, dominant people, when under stress, become more dominant.
Yes, they do.
They get more task focused. And people who are the opposite tend to become more quiet, more introspective.
Further into it.
And they tend to avoid conflict. A dominant person just wants to have that conflict, get it sorted, get it out in the open, get it done, rip off the Band-Aid.
Right.
Where maybe somebody else has a completely opposite approach.
They need to retract. They need to think about it.
They're both trying to get to the exact same conclusion, but they're taking complete opposite ways. And under pressure, both tend to do the same thing, which ends up repelling each other.
Yes. One of my favorite leaders, he has this Sadhguru, he always says, the person who goes to the bar and the person who goes to the temple is trying to find the same thing.
Yeah. I like that. I hadn't heard that before. That's good.
So I'm so glad you went there, because that was actually exactly what was on my mind, because we started out in this talk saying that these were tools and great for remote, but that they were specific to uncertain times. And as we were talking, I was like, well, how does this connect? And you read my mind, you jumped right into it. And I just wanted to recap, paraphrase, as it were, this active listening as we talked about.
Yeah, play this all back for me.
Yeah, guys. So if you didn't catch that, again, the reason this whole concept of understanding these cultural differences, of understanding these communication tools, not only so there's not miscommunication in your business, that things are getting done correctly or fluently, but also as we are all going through very uncertain times, that we can understand that, these types of communication styles or situations or cultural differences get exacerbated in certain ways, and how they manifest themselves, how they show themselves, and how that even furthermore helps us continue communication, remove ourselves from taking things personally. I mean, there's a whole host of things, like you said, it really can go into behavioral. This goes into a whole level of self-awareness that, you may think is just kind of maybe the Tony Robbins or too woo-woo, but let's be honest, that you're part of this. You're there, you're showing up. And in our show, I mean, this is called the My Design Life for a reason, because this, if you want to make it to the best part, if you want to, get to the top of whatever that is, whether it's driving your team, driving your own success, these are the pieces and the components that you need to make that happen, especially in this day and age of global work and some chaos.
Yep. Yes.
So
yes, everything's being multiplied, whether it's because of the technology, the situation, the outside noise. I mean, I was just on a virtual wine tasting before this. I was doing research. I actually was. I was researching because I'm going to be doing some more of these things. But it's delicious wine. But this was a group out of Australia, and this year they had flooding. They had the bushfires. They've got COVID-19. There was a woman on from Philippines. They had a volcano erupting within the vicinity of the capital of Manila. Mm-hmm. You've got China, you've got Hong Kong, you've got all of these places that are having all of these moving, crazy parts. I mean, we are in most definitely uncertain times. Yeah. The markets are all over the place. Teams are under stress. So all of this stuff starts with a lot of fear. It's a lot of fear, and I think that this is the time. It sounds cliche, but like this is the time to sit back, have a breath, have some tea, have a glass of wine, and think about what makes you tick. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not the most I can't go through this on my own. I need some help, and so I do think that these behavioral studies help, these tests help. I think that the culture data out there helps people define stuff that they kind of know, but it just puts a definition to it. If you can start defining it more clearly and you can measure it, then you can manage it. So that's absolutely the mindset and the approach. I'm a huge believer, and something that people hear me say often is, a lot of times we want to discover clarity. Oh, I just got to find clarity. And I really wholeheartedly believe that clarity is actually just found through being asked the right questions. Yeah. It's not that this pile of undiscovered, oh, now I get it. But rarely are we asked the questions. We get asked when we're a kid, what do you want to be with you when you grow up? And it kind of stops there. Most questions are about what's happening in the moment, but rarely are we asked, so how, even the simple ones you were saying that were done in the study, how do you work? How do you respond to this? When is the last time, and I'll challenge any of you listening, that someone asked you that and you stopped and had to think, how do I do that? And that's the thing. And I think that's the power of something like your book, is that we get a moment to actually think and have these questions asked, and think about it, identify it, and become aware. And again, going with the cliche, awareness is the first step. Awareness is the thing that brings us into knowing, how, all kinds of things about ourselves, but as totally in our work environments as well, our remote work, teams, all of these things, which is then going to allow us to have a better experience, more successful experience, and hopefully learn a bunch of awesome, cool cultural things as well.
So
I know we're probably wrapping up in a minute here, but let me just kind of give I don't know if it's a warning or a sales pitch or a combination of both, but the book was very much deliberately not written as a traditional business book. This is not, I wasn't out there competing with those people that I referenced earlier. Even Saba's book it's a very different style. What I did was I took a narrative approach of kind of goofy, sometimes just like a little bit of a weird stories, the stories that don't always have the nice, perfect, everybody lives happily ever after once we apply this model. I wanted to go after some characters that weren't always likable or a little bit more complicated. They're all going through all this stuff.
That's the real people, though.
That's what I wanted. And I wanted to just say, okay, let's put this data to the test. Does it work? And it doesn't always work. And so I say that, if you're into this stuff and you want to go the academic route, there's great research on this stuff, and I recommend it. I've wrestled through it. What I tried to do, and this is how I sold it to the publisher, quite frankly. I said, what if we I want to take Gert Hofstede and have him meet Hunter S. Thompson at a bar and see what comes out of that. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I say that as a warning because it's a little bit more, there's a little bit of little bit edgy there, but hopefully people find that fun and an easy, fun read.
Absolutely. No, I think I'm so excited for this too. And do we have any idea when this is going to be out?
Yeah, so it goes live. It's on Amazon now for pre-order. It goes live on June 16th. Is when it's available. The pre-order, if people pre-order, it makes a huge difference for authors, as I'm sure you know. Yes. I'll be running promotions and doing all sorts of stuff. So we'll try and, I think if you pre-order it at whatever price it's at, if we do any promotions, you automatically pay the lowest price between now and when it goes live. So,
okay. Well, since we're already here, let's just go into it. Tell everyone, let's learn a little more about this book. Tell them about the book, where we can find it, how we connect with you, find you, what your business offers. Let's just go into all of it.
All right. We'll crescendo here with all the, with the big sales pitch.
Well, not only do you get a hold of him for all this stuff, but we're going to find out more about this virtual wine tasting he's doing as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. So here, the way to find out about that is my website is a good starting point, which is leadershipnomad.com.
Perfect.
There is a whole landing page about the book. It'll pop up saying, get onto this newsletter. I send a newsletter out once a month. I try not to bother people. It's a handful of survival guide ideas, things that we've been talking about today. It will also be invitations to these types of virtual wine tastings and different events and promotions and all this sort of stuff. So that would be probably the best thing for people to do, just to kind of keep an eye on me, and I won't bother them that much with spammy email. Okay. Right. So that's that. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I've never been on Facebook.
Lucky man.
I've never been on Instagram. I'm a bit of a Luddite from that standpoint. I am on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn under my name. Or I think my handle on LinkedIn is Slapdragons. And the reason it's Slapdragons, quick story from the book, that was originally the original name of the book.
Okay.
Because I had a client, I keep picking on Americans, but my fellow Americans. I had this client years ago from the States who wanted me to sell his stuff across Southeast Asia. And he sent me and he had never been over to the region. He didn't know anything about it. He wanted to essentially cut and paste what he was doing because he just didn't know about the cultural differences. He sent me this marketing material, and it had like baseball images and US spelling, and it was just the most American-centric looking document I'd ever seen in my life. And I'm trying to talk him through that and, trying to get him to make all these changes. And he was getting more and more frustrated about it. And he said, you know what? Just slap a dragon on it, make it Asian. And that stuck with me for so long, because I think that there's so many people and companies that kind of do that all the time, right?
Yeah.
They just kind of are like, oh, it's Asian, let's put a dragon on it. And it happens the other way as well, right? It's like,
oh yeah,
we all have these preconceived notions of what it's like. And so, let's just slap this thing on it and make it. So anyway, Slapdragons is the handle on LinkedIn.
all right. Okay. So we'll have that
long-winded way of
we'll have that down below here. So that's awesome. You guys keep an eye out for the book. So it sounds like you get on there, find him. Before we wrap up, what is one thing that someone can try to do, this week, as soon as this week, if they want to go, as we're waiting for the book, if we can't read the book yet, what can we do for like, wow, I haven't paid attention to who I am, how I'm communicating, what's going on culturally in, with my team or as I'm working remotely. They're probably not going to jump in and learn everything about this person's culture or communication. What is something that we can do immediately to maybe start to be better at this?
I think that, just going after just following up from the conversation that we've just had, I think the self-reflection is really important. Connect with me and send me an email asking me for that assessment test. I've got them. I'll send you a free test right off the bat.
I love that.
Walk you through the details of it. If you've got a team, I'm happy to give kind of an intro of some of the data that we've been talking about, show some of the visualizations that are out there.
Nice.
Because of a book promotion, I'm a cheap date these days because, it's just about getting the word out there and doing it. So I think that would be a good one.
Okay.
I do think that, with all of that aside, I think that the simple tool of active listening, of ultimate active listening that we talked about, is probably one massive thing that can help anybody right away improving team relationships by just driving clarity. And trying to get that summary before a conversation ends to establish what's going to happen next.
I love that. Okay, so an assessment, you can get a free assessment. You're going to get a hold of him, get a hold of the Slapdragon over here. And of course, as always, we have that information here for you. And then try this active listening. Like, just be mindful of it. Put yourself a note somewhere that you're trying this kind of paraphrasing, recap, making sure you're on the same page, and take some action to move into this better style of communication. And again, as most things has come through our show with business-based, it always bleeds into life. All these tools can be used for partners, for families, for everybody. So, communication affects everyone. We communicate in all different ways. So that awareness, these tools, they go everywhere. So thank you so much for being here, Kyle. It was great. Fun talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tanya.
Yes. Well, you guys make sure to go and get connected with this man. If you are ready to maybe even just take the leap, you're sitting in I know a lot of people are in a different mindset now going, you know what, I've been thinking about this remote work, staying home, doing something in other countries, harness that global opportunity. This is where you're going to go and learn how to do it the best way. So get on his newsletter, keep an eye out for his upcoming book, and connect with him on LinkedIn. Stop thinking about it. Get the support that you need and start moving forward. So Kyle, thank you again. And thank you all for showing up to learn how to create your best life. As always, you can connect with us at My Design Life Show and at Tanyamfk on Facebook and Instagram, and learn more about our courses, workshops, and coaching at Tanyamfk.com. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe, follow, and be notified when our next show is up by clicking that button now. And remember, your someday starts today. Make it the best. I'm Tanyamfk. See you next time. Thanks for joining us. You can catch us every week at 1 p.m. EST live on the My Design Life Show Facebook page and on YouTube at the Tanyamfk channel. See how the challenges go by following us on Facebook and Instagram at My Design Life Show and at Tanyamfk. Do you have a method, tip, or hack you'd like to share or explore? Submit to be a guest or suggest a topic by visiting mydesignlife.show.